Welcome back, Army! Have you ever wondered what happens behind closed doors when the world's biggest boy band hits pause? We saw their brave military salutes and reassuring smiles, but what about the silent tears shed when the cameras finally stopped rolling? Today, we're diving deep into the untold emotional roller coaster of BTS during their grueling hiatus and the explosive comeback rumors. Who cried alone in the dark dorm? Who sent a desperate midnight text that shattered the other members' hearts? And what mind-blowing, highly guarded surprise secretly awaits us in the massive Arirang World Tour 2026? Prepare your tissues and brace yourselves, because we are uncovering the rawest, most vulnerable secrets of their unbreakable brotherhood. Are you ready for the heartbreaking truth they tried so hard to hide? Number 7. RM, the heavy crown of a solo captain, bursting into tears at dawn. Picture this. It is 3 a.m. in the freezing, dimly lit barracks of the 15th Infantry Division in Hwacheon, Gangwon Province, where the harsh, biting winter wind of the Korean peninsula howls mercilessly outside, but an even heavier, more silent storm is brewing inside the heart of Kim Namjoon. Welcome to the unseen, agonizing reality of global superstardom, where the man who once stood confidently at the prestigious podium of the United Nations General Assembly, delivering powerful, world-changing speeches of self-love and generational unity to millions, now finds himself entirely alone in the suffocating, eerie quiet of a standard military cot, completely stripped of his designer suits, his golden microphones, and most devastatingly of all, his 6 soulmates. Have you ever stopped to wonder just how incredibly heavy the crown of leadership truly is when the kingdom you built is suddenly put on pause? For over a decade, RM has been the unshakable pillar, the brilliant brain, and the towering spokesperson for BTS, always carefully translating their collective thoughts into eloquent English, always shielding the younger members from the aggressive media, and always carrying the paralyzing pressure of being the captain of the biggest music phenomenon on planet Earth. But what happens when the captain suddenly loses his crew? According to deep dive insider reflections and the deeply poetic, melancholic letters Namjoon has shared on Weverse during his enlistment, the transition from the deafening, earth-shattering roar of 90,000 screaming armies at Wembley Stadium to the strict, regimented, and mind-numbingly quiet routine of a military band soldier was a psychological whiplash that nobody could have truly prepared him for. Behind his stoic, commanding face and the tough exterior of his buzz cut, there was a deeply sensitive artist desperately struggling with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. We all know RM is a profound thinker, a man who wanders through art museums to find peace, but during those long, isolated military nights, his thoughts became his own worst enemy. The heartbreaking truth that recently slipped through the cracks of their tightly guarded inner circle is that RM actually burst into tears in the dead of night, utterly overwhelmed by a sudden, violent wave of nostalgia. Imagine being in his shoes. You were scrolling through your phone during your brief, strictly monitored free time, and you open the BTS group chat, a chat that used to vibrate with hundreds of chaotic messages a day, filled with Jin's ridiculous, eye-rolling dad jokes, Suga's dry, savage one-liners, J-Hope's blindingly loud voice notes, Jimin's affectionate emojis, V's bizarre, out-of-nowhere abstract photos, and Jungkook's endless hyperactive workout videos. Now, that same chat is hauntingly quiet, reduced to sporadic check-ins and formal military updates. It was reported that on one particularly grueling winter night, RM held a tiny, worn-out photo card of the 7 of them from the emotional 2022 yet-to-come Busan concert, a secret, precious talisman he kept hidden perfectly inside his military notebook. And as he absent-mindedly traced the small 7 friendship tattoo inked on his ankle in the dark, the invincible leader finally broke down, sobbing quietly so as not to wake his fellow soldiers. He realized that for the very first time in his entire adult life, he was navigating this massive, terrifying world entirely without his compass, without his anchors, and the sheer, crushing weight of missing his brothers physically hurt his chest. He missed the chaotic backstage arguments, the shared plates of cheap delivery food, and even the exhausting dance practices that used to drain his energy. He realized that his identity was so deeply intertwined with those 6 other men that standing alone felt like trying to breathe with only half a lung. But Army, here is the spectacular, mind-blowing twist that makes this documentary-worthy narrative so incredibly inspiring. Namjoon's tears of profound longing did not end in despair or depression, but rather they miraculously watered the seeds of the most ambitious, emotionally devastating, and explosive comeback plan in the history of the music industry, laying the highly classified groundwork for the jaw-dropping Arirang World Tour 2026. Why the name Arirang? If you dive into Korean history, the traditional folk song Arirang is the ultimate cultural anthem of sorrowful parting, deep yearning, and the agonizing, hopeful wait for a loved one's inevitable return, a concept that perfectly, beautifully mirrors the painful hiatus of BTS and their loyal army. But Namjoon, being the absolute genius mastermind that he is, ingeniously flipped this tragic script, designing the tour's core thematic concept as a triumphant, earth-shattering celebration of reunion rather than a mourning of separation. Rumor has it that right there under the dim, flickering light of his military-issued flashlight, with tear-stained cheeks and a fiercely burning determination in his eyes, RM began drafting the initial top-secret blueprints for the 2026 tour's revolutionary setlist and stage design. He reportedly wrote a passionate, multi-page, highly confidential handwritten letter and sent it straight to Bang Si-hyuk and the Big Hit Music Executive Board, aggressively demanding that the 2026 comeback tour must feature a groundbreaking 360-degree rotating stage to symbolize their full-circle journey, and an opening sequence so intensely emotional that it would make the legendary Spring Day era look like child's play. He envisioned a dramatic, theatrical, cinematic opening where the 7 members, emerging simultaneously from 7 different isolated corners of a massive stadium representing their individual lonely military journeys, slowly and deliberately walk towards the center to reunite under a single blinding white spotlight, physically colliding back into the unbreakable 7 that they are. When the other members secretly read Namjoon's brilliant Arirang proposal during their respective scattered military leaves, it reportedly sparked a massive chain reaction of emotional breakdowns in their private group chat, with all 7 men fiercely vowing to return to the stage stronger, fitter, and more fiercely united than ever before in the year 2025, perfectly setting the stage for the 2026 global domination. So, the next time you listen to RM's raw, introspective solo masterpiece, Right Place, Wrong Person, or read his beautifully complex letters, remember the hidden, silent tears of a leader who bore the agonizing weight of absence in the freezing dark, only to brilliantly channel that very heartbreak into engineering the most magnificent, record-shattering world tour surprise that will undoubtedly leave the entire globe breathless and weeping.
Number 6. Jin, the cheerful pillar's silent agony, a solo return to an empty castle. Step into the heavy, deeply polished combat boots of Kim Seok-jin, guys, because this one is gonna hit you right in the feels. We all know him as the undeniably gorgeous, worldwide handsome, and the eternal, fiercely protective older brother of BTS, who bravely and selflessly marched first into the daunting, terrifying unknown of the South Korean military, specifically the fiercely disciplined 5th Infantry Division Training Center in Yeongcheon, an area notoriously famous for its brutally freezing winter temperatures, unforgivingly harsh mountainous terrain, and bone-chilling winds that cut straight through the thickest of military-issued winter uniforms. As the absolute eldest member of this globally unprecedented septet, Jin has always masterfully masked his deepest anxieties and darkest fears behind a brilliantly shining, confident facade of flying kisses, outrageously hilarious dad jokes, and a booming, incredibly infectious windshield wiper laugh that could effortlessly brighten the gloomiest, most pressure-filled backstage dressing rooms across the globe, deliberately and willingly absorbing the intense, suffocating psychological pressure of their monumental fame, so that his 6 younger brothers could comfortably and fearlessly shine in the blinding spotlight without carrying a single heavy worry in their precious hearts. But what truly happens to the ultimate, unwavering caretaker of the group when there is suddenly, shockingly, absolutely no one left around him to take care of? Let us delicately peel back the meticulously crafted, heavily guarded layers of his perpetually cheerful, brilliantly optimistic persona to reveal a truly heartbreaking, raw confession that will undoubtedly shatter your emotional core into a million jagged, unfixable pieces. While the entire global media heavily praised and proudly celebrated his impressively rapid, almost superhuman military promotions, from a standard recruit to a corporal, and eventually to a highly respected, deeply feared elite special class warrior and assistant drill instructor, lauding his flawless textbook work ethic and his unyielding patriotic dedication to his country, a much more sorrowful, deeply hidden, and intimately painful reality was quietly playing out behind the heavily guarded, steel-framed barracks doors the moment the relentless, screaming drill whistles finally faded into the silent, suffocating, intensely lonely night. You must deeply understand that Jin is a remarkably empathetic man whose entire adult universe fundamentally and spiritually revolves around feeding, playfully teasing, and fiercely loving the younger members. He is the legendary, warm-hearted guy who famously used his own meager, hard-earned allowance to buy groceries, cook massive, comforting homemade meals, and personally drive a young, deeply homesick teenage Jungkook to high school back in their incredibly cramped, intensely humid, and financially struggling pre-debut dorms. To suddenly and violently transition from being the beloved, constantly surrounded, chaotic nucleus of a hyperactive, tightly knit 7-man family to an authoritative, isolated, and incredibly intimidating military figure commanding fresh, nervous recruits who looked at him with sheer, terrified awe and an unbridgeable, respectful distance was an incredibly jarring, desperately lonely, and psychologically taxing experience that forcefully and painfully ripped him away from his carefully built, decade-long comfort zone. Deep dive insider reports and deeply emotional, heavily retrospective whispers from extremely close, trusted staff members strongly hint at a specific, agonizingly quiet evening, perhaps during his deeply isolated military birthday in December, completely separated from the extravagant, chaotic, and loud celebrations of his past, when Jin was graciously granted a brief, strictly monitored moment to use his mobile phone, only to stare blankly and tragically at a cold, unfeeling digital screen filled with formal, automated congratulatory messages from military personnel instead of the usual deafeningly loud, physically aggressive, cake-smashing, beautifully chaotic frenzy he had grown so deeply, warmly accustomed to over the past phenomenal, record-breaking decade. It is passionately said that in that profoundly quiet, physically isolating moment, sitting heavily on a stiff, uncomfortable military mattress and holding a simple, standard-issue aluminum cup of lukewarm instant coffee, instead of holding a lavishly decorated, multi-tiered celebratory stage cake, the seemingly invincible, emotionally unbreakable older brother finally let his carefully constructed, incredibly strong guard completely down, his broad, world-famous shoulders violently shaking as a rare, uncontrollable, and deeply sorrowful stream of hot, heavy tears continuously escaped his eyes, severely and physically missing the loud, delightfully irritating, yet incredibly comforting bickering of Jimin and V over trivial things, the sudden, brilliant musical ideas from Suga, the clumsy accidents from RM, and the comforting, bright sunshine aura of J-Hope. This painful realization hit its absolute peak during his highly publicized military discharge in June 2024, while the world cheered and he immediately selflessly rushed to host a massive, unprecedented hug event to physically embrace 1,000 weeping armies just 24 hours after leaving the base, proving his insane dedication to the fandom. He realized with a sudden, crushing, breath-stealing clarity that returning to the civilian world first meant he was physically walking back into a massive, echoing, terrifyingly empty corporate castle, tasked with the immensely difficult, unbelievably heavy burden of independently keeping the colossal BTS legacy passionately alive all by his lonesome singular self. But remaining completely true to his incredibly resilient, deeply selfless, and remarkably brilliant nature, Kim Seok-jin absolutely refused to let that profound, paralyzing sorrow and mind-numbing loneliness consume his brightly creative mind or break his ironclad spirit. Instead, he meticulously and fiercely transformed his sharp, physical, deeply painful yearning into an explosive, top-secret, highly classified creative weapon meticulously designed for the highly anticipated, mind-bending, and culturally monumental Arirang World Tour 2026. While actively navigating his solo era, Jin reportedly sacrificed his rare, deeply exhausted rest days to obsessively and analytically review countless hours of past stadium concert footages, taking meticulous, highly detailed multi-page handwritten notes on group vocal stamina, complex stage pacing, emotional audience engagement, and live stadium acoustics, violently determined to completely and utterly prepare the ground for a historically unprecedented reunion upon his brother's grand return. Intense, highly guarded rumors currently leaking from deep within the fortified Big Hit Entertainment executive creative vaults strongly suggest that Jin independently and brilliantly conceptualized a breathtaking, theatrically devastating, emotionally charged solo stage transition specifically tailored for the groundbreaking 2026 Arirang Tour, a visionary concept deeply and profoundly inspired by his heart-wrenching, beautifully cinematic goodbye anthem, The Astronaut, which he famously performed with Coldplay in a massive stadium in Argentina, but ingeniously and gorgeously twisted to perfectly fit the tour's overarching Arirang theme of ultimate joyous, tear-inducing return and eternal loyalty. He vibrantly envisioned a highly emotional, visually stunning, multi-million-dollar cinematic sequence where he is hopelessly, dramatically wandering through a vast, barren, meteor-showered, beautifully rendered digital galaxy displayed across the stadium's massive state-of-the-art 360-degree LED screens, desperately and anxiously searching the infinite cosmos for 6 lost, intensely shining stars, only to have the entire massive stadium abruptly plunge into absolute, terrifying, pitch-black darkness, creating a moment of sheer, breathless suspense for the screaming fans, before suddenly erupting into a blinding, magnificent, earth-shattering explosion of vibrant purple light and pyrotechnics as the other 6 deeply missed members magically, heroically rise through the hidden stage elevators to finally physically join him side by side, definitively signifying the triumphant end of his lonely, agonizing, years-long watch as the solitary guardian of their eternal legacy. It is an incredibly powerful, tear-jerking, mind-blowing testament to a remarkably strong man who silently and bravely swallowed his own terrifying personal fears, overwhelming anxieties, and immense crushing loneliness just to meticulously, perfectly pave a golden, flawlessly smooth, thoroughly prepared road for his beloved brother's glorious, world-stopping return, powerfully proving once and for all to the entire universe that Kim Seok-jin is truly not just the stunning, universally acclaimed visual center of BTS, but the very beating, bleeding, fiercely loyal titanium heart that relentlessly and lovingly keeps them physically, mentally, and spiritually anchored together through the most chaotic, terrifying, and isolating storms the music industry has ever witnessed in human history. With this unprecedented level of hidden emotional depth, raw pain, and spectacular secretive preparation fueling his every single move, will the rest of the world truly be mentally, spiritually, and emotionally prepared to witness the absolute, unfiltered, deeply mature vocal majesty and the raw, unbridled, explosive passion that Seok-jin has secretly, obsessively been cultivating during those incredibly long, freezing, lonely nights when the legendary, history-making Arirang Tour finally violently kicks off and shakes the very foundations of the globe in 2026.
Number 5. Suga, the stoic producer's secret breakdown, a studio bathed in shadows. Step into the hushed, heavily soundproofed confines of the legendary Genius Lab, guys, because we are about to uncover a deeply hidden, intensely private vulnerability that the famously stoic, brilliantly savage lead producer of BTS has desperately tried to keep locked away from the glaring eyes of the entire world. We all intimately know Min Yoongi as the fiercely independent, aggressively passionate, and incredibly tough August D, the untouchable rap god who spit fire on stage and fearlessly conquered his darkest inner demons for millions to see. But what truly happens when the very brothers who patiently helped him heal those deep psychological scars are suddenly, violently stripped away from his daily life? Unlike the other members who faced the grueling, physically demanding conditions of active military duty, Yoongi's deeply agonizing journey took a profoundly different, yet equally isolating path as a public service worker in Seoul, a mandatory alternative service strictly dictated by his historically devastating, physically limiting, and surgically repaired shoulder, a constant, painful physical reminder of his desperately struggling, agonizing pre-debut days as an impoverished delivery boy fighting fiercely for a dream that felt impossibly far out of reach. Transitioning from the explosive, adrenaline-pumping, earth-shattering highs of his historically sold-out D-Day Global Solo Stadium Tour, where he literally poured his blood, sweat, and agonizing tears onto the stage every single night in front of tens of thousands of screaming, intensely devoted fans, famously breaking down during his final Seoul concert, to the painstakingly mundane, aggressively silent, and highly repetitive administrative routine of a standard government office, was a terrifying psychological whiplash that forcefully threw him into a suffocating, deeply unsettling silence. But the true, heartbreaking agony did not occur within the sterile, brightly lit walls of that public office. It violently ambushed him during the dead of night in the one place he always considered his absolute, impenetrable sanctuary, his recording studio. Close your eyes and vibrantly picture this incredibly poignant scene. It is 4 a.m. in the freezing heart of the Seoul winter, the icy wind aggressively rattling the reinforced glass windows of the big hit building, and Yoongi is sitting entirely alone in his expensive, custom-made ergonomic leather chair, heavily surrounded by millions of dollars worth of state-of-the-art synthesizers, vintage mixing consoles, and massive, imposing studio monitors, yet feeling an incredibly profound, crushing sense of terrifying emptiness that no amount of musical genius could possibly fill. The studio, which for an entire, incredibly chaotic decade constantly vibrated with the deafening, explosive laughter of Jimin tumbling over the sofa, the sudden, hyperactive barging in of an overly energetic Jungkook demanding vocal feedback, the deep, intellectual, midnight philosophical debates with RM about complex lyrical wordplay, and the bright, blindingly positive, sunshine-like energy of J-Hope casually dropping by to hype up a new, aggressive beat, was now hauntingly, deafeningly, brutally silent.
Highly trusted, deeply embedded industry insiders and close, intensely loyal audio engineers have recently quietly leaked a profoundly devastating story about a specific, incredibly dark night when Yoongi, desperately trying to fight off a crippling wave of severe insomnia and intense missing, obsessively opened the massive, incredibly complex digital project files of their deeply emotional, historically monumental track Tear and the universally comforting, culturally shifting anthem Spring Day. He reportedly painstakingly isolated the raw, entirely unedited, breathing vocal stems of his 6 deeply cherished brothers, playing them on an endless, agonizing loop at maximum volume just to desperately create the fragile, heartbreaking illusion that they were physically standing right there in the heavily padded booth with him, fiercely missing the comforting, undeniable magical synergy that only miraculously sparks when the 7 of them are perfectly, harmoniously locked together in a single, creatively chaotic room. It is passionately, quietly whispered that as the deeply soulful, heavily emotional, isolated high note of Jin smoothly transitioned into the deeply resonant, incredibly grounding, velvety baritone of Taeyoung, the notoriously unbreakable rock of BTS, the man who famously maintained a fiercely stoic, unbothered expression through the most chaotic, terrifying media storms, entirely lost his battle against his own overwhelming heart, violently breaking down into heavy, uncontrollable, body-shaking sobs, burying his tear-stained face deep into his pale, exhausted hands as he violently realized that his incredible, world-conquering musical empire felt entirely, hopelessly meaningless without his 6 soulmates there to playfully annoy him, aggressively challenge him, and unconditionally love him. However, if there is one absolute, undeniable truth about Min Yoongi, it is that he is a brilliant, terrifyingly resilient alchemist who has consistently, historically mastered the incredible art of flawlessly transforming his deepest, darkest, most agonizing pain into absolute, groundbreaking, chart-shattering musical gold. He absolutely refused to let that paralyzing, suffocating sorrow permanently defeat his fiercely burning creative spirit. Instead, he aggressively, obsessively channeled that profound, tear-soaked longing into secretly, meticulously forging the insanely complex, mind-bending, culturally revolutionary sonic backbone for the highly anticipated, wildly explosive, deeply classified Arirang World Tour 2026. Rumors aggressively swirling within the highest, most secretive echelons of the Korean music production industry strongly suggest that Yoongi has spent his deeply exhausted, isolated weekends heavily researching and brilliantly deconstructing the deeply melancholy, historically tragic traditional Korean folk song, Arirang, a cultural masterpiece that perfectly, tragically embodies the excruciating pain of waiting for a fiercely loved one who has been painfully separated by cruel, unforgiving circumstances. But Yoongi, being the absolute, unmatched visionary genius that he is, ingeniously and violently flipped the desperately sad narrative entirely on its head, brilliantly fusing the heartbreaking, deeply emotional acoustic wails of traditional Korean instruments like the haegum and the gyeogum, instruments he previously mastered for his solo works, with massive, violently aggressive, stadium-shaking 808 bass drops, terrifyingly heavy trap snares, and grand, sweeping, multi-million-dollar cinematic orchestral string arrangements to create a radically new, triumphant, earth-shattering new musical genre specifically designed to celebrate their glorious, unstoppable reunion rather than mourning their agonizing separation. He is heavily rumored to have secretly composed an entirely new, absolutely massive 7-minute instrumental overture strictly for the 2026 tour's grand, explosive opening sequence, a track so violently emotional, incredibly intense, and breathtakingly heavy that when he silently played a rough, unmixed demo for an incredibly emotional J-Hope during a rare, highly secretive, tightly guarded military leave meetup, the usually bright dancer was completely, instantly rendered speechless, immediately bursting into heavy, uncontrollable sobs at the sheer, overwhelming, paralyzing power of the deeply passionate melody. Yoongi deeply envisions a highly dramatic, incredibly theatrical, visually mind-blowing stadium stage design where he heroically, violently rises from the hidden depths of the massive stage, passionately playing a grand, fiercely burning piano while the entire stadium is completely engulfed in a violent, beautifully synchronized, wildly flashing sea of millions of glowing purple army bombs, perfectly, violently bridging the agonizing, tear-filled gap between their fragmented, lonely past and their brilliantly shining, indestructible, historically unprecedented future. With this incredible level of deep, unspoken emotional agony and terrifyingly fierce, obsessive musical preparation secretly fueling every single note he writes, how will the entire world possibly survive the emotional annihilation, the sheer sonic devastation, and the raw, unfiltered passion of hearing Yoongi's deeply scarred, incredibly brilliant soul poured directly into the colossal, ground-shaking speakers of the Arirang World Tour? And are you truly, deeply mentally prepared to witness the spectacular, tear-soaked, history-making masterpiece that this absolute genius producer fiercely built from the cold, lonely ashes of his darkest, most isolated nights?
Number 4. J-Hope, The Sunshine's Fading Light, a dance studio frozen in time. Step right into the impeccably clean, razor-sharp, and terrifyingly strict combat boots of Sergeant Jung Hosok Army, because what we are absolutely about to uncover together will completely shatter the brilliantly shining, blindingly bright image of the eternal sunshine of BTS and plunge you into a deeply emotional, breathtakingly raw abyss of unspoken longing. We all intimately know and fiercely love J-Hope as the absolute, undisputed dance captain, the incredibly energetic beating heart, and the relentlessly positive, infectious mood maker of the entire group. A phenomenally talented man who famously and single-handedly conquered the massive, intimidating stage of Lollapalooza in Chicago as a historic solo headliner, proving to the entire watching world that his raw, unfiltered talent, his hip-hop roots, and his commanding, aggressive stage presence are genuinely an unstoppable force of nature. But when he bravely and proudly enlisted as an active duty soldier and fiercely climbed the grueling, physically agonizing ranks to officially become a highly respected, deeply feared, and notoriously strict elite assistant drill instructor at the prestigious 36th Infantry Division, famously known as the legendary White Tiger Division, located in the unforgivingly rugged, deeply isolated mountainous terrain of Wonju, a heartbreakingly profound and utterly devastating psychological shift occurred far, far away from the flashing, blinding cameras, the glamorous music show waiting rooms, and the deafening, earth-shattering cheers of massive stadium crowds. You have to vividly imagine the intense, suffocating psychological dissonance he experienced daily. The man who literally built his entire life, identity, and wildly successful career around projecting pure, unadulterated joy, throwing up bright peace signs, and constantly showering his 6 beloved brothers with endless hyperactive affection, was suddenly forced to lock all of that vibrant energy away inside a deeply rigid, incredibly stoic, and aggressively demanding military persona, aggressively barking harsh, echoing disciplinary orders at terrified new recruits instead of joyfully counting 5, 6, 7, 8 to a room full of panting, laughing, incredibly synchronized superstars.
Deep dive, highly confidential insider accounts and intensely emotional whisperings from heavily verified industry choreographers strongly suggest that the true, agonizing weight of this complete isolation finally crashed down upon him with the sheer, devastating force of a runaway freight train on a particularly freezing, deeply quiet weekend night inside the barren, strictly regimented military barracks. A night when the profound, echoing silence became entirely too loud for his rhythm-obsessed brain to handle. It is passionately, quietly reported that Hobie, desperately fighting a sudden, crippling wave of homesickness that literally made his chest physically ache, secretly pulled out his heavily protected mobile phone under the dim, artificial glow of his standard-issue military blanket and began obsessively rewatching old, deeply chaotic, raw footage from their legendary mic drop and run BTS dance practice videos, intensely staring at the small screen as his eyes drank in the beautifully messy, intensely chaotic dynamic that he missed with every single fiber of his being. He watched Jimin giggling uncontrollably and dramatically collapsing onto the hard wooden floor. He watched Jungkook playfully and aggressively mimicking his strict dance instructions. He watched RM clumsily but endearingly knocking over a water bottle. And he watched Jin aggressively complaining about his aching muscles while simultaneously executing the moves perfectly. And as he watched this beautiful, vibrant ghost of his past life, the notoriously strong, fiercely positive emotional pillar of BTS finally broke down completely, a heavy, silent, and incredibly profound stream of hot tears violently rushing down his perfectly sculpted, sun-kissed cheeks as he suddenly realized that a dance floor without his 6 soulmates was nothing more than an empty, meaningless void of cold, lifeless wood. The sheer, terrifying realization that he could not simply reach out and physically hug them, that he could not loudly praise their hard work, and that he could not feel the magical, vibrating synergy of their combined footsteps, shaking the very foundation of the high building, threw him into a state of deep, paralyzing emotional mourning, heavily proving that even the brightest, most intensely burning sun can secretly experience a profoundly dark, freezing eclipse when completely separated from the very solar system that gives it beautiful, chaotic purpose. But Army, if you think for one single second that Jung Hoseok allowed that deep, suffocating sadness to permanently extinguish his wildly burning, creative fire, you are absolutely and entirely mistaken, because he miraculously and violently transformed that profound, tear-soaked, agonizing pain into the most meticulously planned, aggressively complex, and culturally explosive choreographic weapon ever designed for the highly classified, mind-bending Arirang World Tour 2026. Rumors aggressively swirling within the highest, most secretive echelons of the global street dance community strongly suggest that during his highly restricted, extremely short military leaves, instead of resting his deeply exhausted, bruised body, J-Hope secretly and obsessively rented out a tiny, private, unlisted underground dance studio in the dead of night, violently throwing himself into hours of grueling, bone-breaking, intensely emotional freestyle sessions until he literally collapsed onto the floor in a pool of his own sweat, desperately trying to physically map out the agonizing journey of their separation and their incredibly triumphant return, using only the raw, unfiltered movement of the human body. He is heavily rumored to have brilliantly and independently conceptualized the most visually terrifying, emotionally devastating, and physically demanding massive dance break sequence in the entire historic decade of BTS's existence, specifically built around the deeply sorrowful yet intensely hopeful traditional rhythm of Arirang, ingeniously fusing heavy, aggressive underground hip-hop popping and bone-breaking with the stunning, fluid, heartbreakingly beautiful traditional Korean ribbon dance movements to violently express the agonizing tension of being ripped apart and the powerful, earth-shattering release of finally snapping back together.
He violently envisions a breathtaking multi-million-dollar stadium sequence where the massive state-of-the-art stage is suddenly plunged into an eerie blood-red darkness, and the 7 members, starting at extreme, isolated opposite ends of the colossal stadium, are physically and aggressively pulled towards the center stage by an invisible, undeniable, magical gravitational force, executing perfectly synchronized, incredibly sharp, violently powerful choreography that vividly tells the heartbreaking story of their lonely military years, culminating in a jaw-dropping massive group formation where they physically interlock their arms and bodies into a giant, unbreakable human fortress, while thousands of explosive fireworks completely obliterate the night sky above them. With this incredible, awe-inspiring level of deeply hidden emotional agony, raw, tear-stained longing, and terrifyingly fierce, obsessive physical preparation, secretly fueling every single masterfully calculated pop, lock, and glide he is currently designing, how on earth will the entire fragile world possibly survive the sheer visual devastation, the explosive, ground-shaking energy, and the deeply passionate, unfiltered kinetic storytelling of Jung Ho-sok when the monumental Arirang Tour finally violently kicks off in 2026? And are you genuinely, deeply mentally prepared to witness the spectacular, tear-inducing, history-making physical masterpiece that the undisputed dance god of BTS fiercely built from the cold, agonizingly silent ashes of his darkest, most isolated military nights?
Number 3. Jimin, the angelic swan's midnight tears, a freezing artillery base longing for warmth. Step right into the heavily fortified, aggressively freezing, and deeply intimidating grounds of the 5th Infantry Division's Artillery Command Army, because we are about to violently pull back the heavy camouflaged curtain on a deeply hidden, intimately heartbreaking reality that will absolutely shatter your soul into a million unfixable pieces and leave you violently gasping for air. We all intimately and passionately know Park Jimin as the ethereal, breathtakingly graceful black swan of BTS, the incredibly affectionate, soft-spoken fairy who is universally renowned as the ultimate emotional glue of the group, a fiercely loyal and incredibly empathetic man whose entire beautiful existence fundamentally thrives on deep physical connection, comforting hugs, and the constant reassuring warmth of leaning his head on his beloved member's broad shoulders during chaotic, high-pressure interviews. When Jimin bravely marched into the grueling, highly disciplined, and terrifyingly rigid world of the South Korean military artillery, even while famously utilizing the incredibly rare companion enlistment system alongside his deeply trusted younger brother Jungkook, the sheer, agonizing absence of the other 5 foundational pillars of his life violently plunged him into a profoundly dark, breathtakingly cold psychological abyss that completely stripped away his vibrant, glittering idol persona. You must vividly and deeply understand the intense, suffocating environmental shock he experienced. Transitioning from flawlessly executing gravity-defying multi-million-dollar contemporary dance solos in sold-out global stadiums, completely surrounded by the deafening, tear-filled screams of tens of thousands of adoring fans and the intensely protective, unconditionally loving aura of his 6 soulmates, to being violently thrust into the hyper-masculine, emotionally barren, and brutally cold reality of heavy artillery training in the treacherous, wind-battered mountains of Yeoncheon, was an emotional whiplash that physically hurt his deeply sensitive heart. Despite his fiercely competitive spirit, his flawless military evaluations, and his famously terrifying, unyielding work ethic that earned him top honors as an elite soldier, the suffocating, echoing silence of the military barracks at night became a terrifying, inescapable prison for a man whose love language is entirely built around physical presence and vocal reassurance. Highly confidential, deeply emotional whispers from heavily verified, intensely trusted inner circle staff members and deeply touching, incredibly raw letters sent from the base reveal a specific, agonizingly quiet winter night when the relentless, biting Korean frost had violently, completely frozen the windows of his military dormitory, and Jimin, desperately seeking a tiny, fragile spark of comfort, secretly pulled his thick, scratchy military-issued blanket entirely over his head, turning on a tiny smuggled-in MP3 player to listen to the raw, unedited, beautifully chaotic vocal stems of their deeply emotional fan anthem, "We Are Bulletproof, the Eternal." It is passionately, quietly reported that as the beautifully comforting, deep baritone voice of Taeyoung smoothly blended with Jin's crystal clear, angelic high notes and the fiercely protective, heavily rhythmic rapping of Namjoon, Yoongi, and Hoseok violently crashed through his tiny earphones, the notoriously resilient, always smiling angel of BTS completely and utterly broke down, his small, incredibly powerful frame violently shaking with heavy, uncontrollable breathless sobs as a profound, burning stream of hot tears violently soaked his cold military pillow, desperately and physically mourning the agonizing loss of his completely safe, chaotic, beautifully messy sanctuary. He heartbreakingly realized in that suffocating, pitch-black darkness that the immense, terrifying world felt incredibly, dangerously hollow without Namjoon's towering, protective leadership, without Jin's brilliantly hilarious, mood-lifting antics, without Yoongi's quiet, deeply observant care, without Hoseok's blindingly bright, sunshine-like encouragement, and without Taeyoung's deep, soulful, twin-like understanding, leaving him feeling utterly exposed and desperately, incredibly alone, despite being surrounded by hundreds of fellow soldiers. But, Army, knowing the incredibly fierce, brilliantly transformative, and absolutely terrifying perfectionist that Park Jimin truly is beneath his soft, angelic exterior, he absolutely and entirely refused to allow that profound, paralyzing, tear-soaked agony to permanently clip his beautifully expansive wings. Instead, he aggressively, obsessively, and miraculously channeled that immense, crushing sorrow into meticulously, secretly forging the most visually terrifying, emotionally devastating, and breathtakingly theatrical stage production ever conceived in the history of live entertainment for the highly classified, mind-bending Arirang World Tour 2026. Now that we are actually breathing the air of this historically monumental year of 2026, massive, aggressively swirling rumors from the highest, most secretive echelons of HYBE's creative directing team strongly suggest that Jimin has spent every single deeply exhausted, physically draining military leave obsessively conceptualizing a groundbreaking, gravity-defying contemporary solo masterpiece perfectly infused with the tragic, deeply sorrowful, yet fiercely hopeful thematic essence of the traditional Korean Arirang, brilliantly translating his agonizing military isolation into a jaw-dropping visual spectacle of violent rebirth and unstoppable reunion. He is heavily rumored to have independently designed an incredibly dangerous, multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art wire flying sequence where he begins the stage violently trapped inside a massive, dimly lit, terrifyingly realistic ice cage positioned in the dead center of the colossal stadium, physically representing the freezing, agonizing isolation of their grueling military hiatus. Before the insanely powerful, earth-shattering voices of his 6 returning brothers suddenly echo through the massive stadium speakers, causing the magical ice to violently shatter into millions of glittering, digitally rendered diamond shards. In a breathtaking, heart-stopping climax, Jimin will reportedly be violently launched hundreds of feet into the stadium sky, completely suspended by invisible wires, executing flawless, heartbreakingly beautiful, fiercely emotional contemporary aerial acrobatics while hitting an impossibly high, deeply resonant vocal note that completely transcends human emotion, gracefully and fiercely landing right into the waiting, fiercely protective, and deeply loving physical embrace of his 6 deeply missed soulmates, violently signaling the glorious, unstoppable, and historically unprecedented return of the kings of pop. With this incredible, awe-inspiring level of deeply hidden emotional trauma, raw, tear-stained midnight longing, and terrifyingly fierce, obsessive artistic preparation secretly fueling every single breathtaking spin and earth-shattering high note he is currently perfecting, how on earth will the entire emotionally fragile world possibly survive the sheer visual devastation, the explosive, ground-shaking energy, and the deeply passionate, completely unfiltered emotional storytelling of Park Jimin when the monumental Arirang Tour violently takes over the globe this year? And are you genuinely, deeply, mentally prepared to witness the spectacular, tear-inducing, history-making masterpiece that this beautifully scarred, absolute angel fiercely built from the cold, agonizingly silent ashes of his darkest, most deeply isolated military nights?
Number 2. V. The Soulful Bear's Tactical Agony, a counter-terrorism mission devoid of color. Step directly into the heavy, terrifyingly intimidating and pitch-black tactical gear of Kim Tae-young Army, because what we are about to vividly uncover regarding the deeply hidden, intensely private emotional struggles of BTS's ultimate visual king and beautifully soulful baritone will absolutely leave you gasping for air and clutching your chest in sheer unprecedented agony. We all intimately and passionately know V as the brilliantly eccentric, incredibly artistic, and breathtakingly handsome free spirit of the group, a fiercely unique man who famously and effortlessly navigates the glamorous, high-end fashion world as the global face of luxury brands like Celine and Cartier, a deeply romantic, incredibly sensitive soul who finds profound, quiet comfort in the slow, crackling sounds of vintage vinyl jazz records, the abstract strokes of classic gallery paintings, and the warm, fluffy, deeply comforting cuddles of his beloved Pomeranian Yeontan. But when Tae-young made the genuinely shocking, undeniably brave, and terrifyingly ambitious decision to voluntarily enlist in the notoriously grueling, highly elite, and fiercely dangerous Special Duty Team, heavily known as the SDT, a specialized, fiercely respected military police unit exclusively dedicated to high-stakes counter-terrorism operations, intense hostage rescues, and extremely dangerous, life-threatening urban warfare tactics, he actively and violently threw himself into a brutally rigid, hyper-masculine, and deeply unforgiving environment that was the absolute polar opposite of his beautifully colorful, slow-paced, and profoundly artistic universe. You absolutely must vividly and deeply comprehend the immense, suffocating psychological weight of this extreme, mind-bending transition, moving abruptly from gracefully, seductively performing his jazz-infused solo masterpieces like Singularity and the incredibly soulful, deeply melancholic tracks from his historically acclaimed solo album Layover, specifically the heart-wrenching vibes of Love Me Again and Slow Dancing, in a stunning, multi-million-dollar theatrical costume, completely surrounded by the deafening, tear-filled, and intensely passionate screams of tens of thousands of adoring, fiercely loyal fans across sold-out global stadiums, to aggressively and forcefully breaching heavily barricaded doors in the freezing dead of night, while wearing over 40 pounds of suffocating, pitch-black Kevlar tactical armor, carrying a heavy, fully loaded K-1A submachine gun, and strictly communicating entirely through sharp, silent military hand signals, instead of his deeply expressive, beautifully soulful singing voice. Despite his phenomenal, historically impressive physical transformation, famously gaining significant muscle mass and earning widespread, intense public admiration for his flawlessly executed movie-like tactical training videos that went incredibly viral across the globe, the heavy, echoing, and profoundly isolating silence of his highly restricted, highly classified military barracks at the absolute end of a grueling, physically devastating training day became a deeply terrifying, inescapable emotional cage for a fiercely affectionate man whose absolute entire existence fundamentally thrives on chaotic, physical closeness and the brilliantly warm, family-like synergy of his 6 beloved brothers. highly confidential, intensely emotional whispers actively leaking from deeply trusted, heavily verified military insiders, and incredibly raw, tear-jerking anecdotes shared quietly among his closest, most heavily guarded inner circle violently reveal a specific, agonizingly silent night in the harsh, biting cold of the Korean winter, shortly after a brutal, multi-day, physically exhausting tactical simulation in the freezing mountains, when Taeyoung, desperately seeking just a tiny, fragile fragment of his beautifully vibrant past life, secretly sought refuge in a quiet, isolated corner of the base with his strictly monitored military phone. It is passionately, quietly reported that as he blankly stared at his locked digital screen, which heavily featured a wildly chaotic, joyously beautiful, and intensely messy, candid group photo taken in the cramped, incredibly noisy dressing room right before their historically monumental, yet-to-come concert in Busan, the notoriously strong, deeply enigmatic, and universally adored visual pillar of BTS completely and utterly lost his fiercely guarded composure, his broad, newly muscular shoulders violently shaking with heavy, uncontrollable, and deeply breathless sobs as a profound, burning stream of hot, silent tears violently rushed down his perfectly sculpted, dirt-smudged, and physically exhausted face, deeply and physically mourning the agonizing, terrifying absence of his fiercely protective soulmates. He heartbreakingly, violently realized in that suffocating, pitch-black tactical darkness that the immense, highly disciplined, and incredibly dangerous world of the SDT felt entirely, devastatingly hollow without Jimin's infectious, high-pitched, giggling laughter that always perfectly complemented his deep voice as his 95Z twin, without Namjoon's towering, incredibly reassuring, and profoundly intellectual presence, without Jin's brilliantly hilarious, mood-lifting, and utterly chaotic energy, without Yoongi's quiet, deeply observant, and incredibly anchoring care, without Hosok's blindingly bright, violently positive, and passionately encouraging sunshine aura, and without Jungkook's playful, intensely competitive, and incredibly endearing little brother antics, leaving him feeling completely, terrifyingly exposed, and desperately, incredibly alone behind his heavy, black tactical balaclava. But Army, deeply knowing the incredibly brilliant, fiercely creative, and absolutely unparalleled artistic genius that Kim Tae-young truly is beneath his devastatingly handsome, incredibly tough military exterior, he absolutely and entirely refused to allow that profound, paralyzing, tear-soaked agony to permanently destroy his beautifully expressive, deeply soulful spirit. Instead, he aggressively, obsessively, and miraculously channeled that immense, crushing, and heavily isolating sorrow into meticulously, secretly directing the most visually terrifying, emotionally devastating, and breathtakingly cinematic stage production ever conceived in the history of live stadium entertainment, specifically for the highly classified, mind-bending Arirang World Tour 2026. Now that we are actually breathing the intensely electric, highly anticipated air of this historically monumental year of 2026, massive, aggressively swirling rumors heavily originating from the highest, most secretive echelons of HYBE's visual directing and creative executive teams violently strongly suggest that Tae-young has actively spent his rare, deeply exhausted, and physically draining military leaves obsessively conceptualizing a groundbreaking, theatrically brilliant solo and group visual masterpiece, perfectly infused with the tragic, deeply sorrowful, yet fiercely romantic and intensely hopeful thematic essence of the traditional Korean Arirang, brilliantly translating his agonizing, hyper-masculine military isolation into a jaw-dropping, seductive, and unbelievably explosive visual spectacle of violent rebirth and unstoppable cinematic reunion.
He is heavily rumored to have independently, brilliantly designed an incredibly dangerous, multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art stage sequence, heavily inspired by a gritty, high-stakes black and white noir film, where he violently begins the stage entirely alone, mysteriously dressed in a heavily modified, high-fashion, intensely glamorous version of his terrifying black SDT tactical gear, physically representing the freezing, agonizing, and heavily armored isolation of his grueling military hiatus, while a deeply melancholic, incredibly slow, and fiercely passionate saxophone plays a heavy, jazz-infused, heartbreakingly slow rendition of the Arirang melody in the absolute dead center of the colossal stadium, captivating the audience in a trance of profound sorrow. In a breathtaking, heart-stopping, and absolutely visually devastating climax that will undoubtedly cause massive global chaos and uncontrollable weeping from millions of fans, Taehyung will reportedly dramatically rip off his heavy tactical vest, just as the massive state-of-the-art stadium LED screens abruptly and violently explode from a cold, bleak black and white aesthetic into a blinding, magnificent, violently vibrant explosion of rich, warm, and deeply passionate colors, aggressively mirroring the exact emotionally explosive moment when the intensely powerful, earth-shattering voices and the physical, undeniably magnetic presence of his 6 fiercely returning brothers suddenly violently crash onto the massive stage from hidden hydraulic lifts, completely surrounding him in a beautifully chaotic, fiercely protective, and deeply loving formation. He envisioned a deeply emotional, violently powerful choreographic moment where they physically interlock their hands, their tear-filled eyes fiercely locking with intense, unbreakable loyalty, violently signaling the glorious, historically unprecedented.
Number 1. Jungkook, the golden Maknae's lonely echo, a cookhouse flooded with tears. Step directly into the intensely steaming, brutally hot, and physically demanding military cookhouse of the 5th Infantry Division in the freezing, unforgiving mountains of Yeonchan Army, because the final, most deeply heartbreaking, and violently emotional revelation we are about to uncover regarding the absolute center of BTS, the globally unparalleled pop prince himself, Jungkook, will utterly and completely shatter whatever tiny, fragile pieces of your heart you still have left. We all passionately, intimately know the golden Maknae as the terrifyingly talented, fiercely competitive, and breathtakingly unstoppable force of nature who completely obliterated the global music industry, single-handedly dominating the Billboard Hot 100 charts, conquering the massive, blindingly lit TSX stage in the absolute heart of Times Square, and cementing his historic, untouchable legacy with his wildly successful, multi-platinum solo masterpiece album, Golden, proving to the entire watching universe that he is the ultimate, unrivaled pop superstar of our modern generation. But when this fiercely independent, heavily tattooed, and brilliantly rebellious artist bravely surrendered his glamorous, high-speed, multi-million-dollar celebrity life to fulfill his mandatory military service, taking on the incredibly grueling, physically exhausting, and completely unrecognized role of a military cook, a position famously known for demanding bone-crushing labor from 4 in the morning until late into the pitch-black night, hauling massive, impossibly heavy sacks of rice and aggressively stirring gigantic boiling vats of soup to feed hundreds of exhausted soldiers. A profound, deeply terrifying psychological and emotional shockwave violently crashed into his beautifully sensitive soul. You absolutely must vividly and deeply understand the immense, heartbreaking magnitude of his unique, deeply personal agony. Unlike any other idol in the history of the Korean entertainment industry, Jungkook literally grew up completely surrounded, fiercely protected, and unconditionally raised by his 6 older brothers since he was just a shy, incredibly introverted 15-year-old boy who arrived in the massive, intimidating city of Seoul
with nothing but a giant, oversized backpack and a violently burning, desperate dream. Namjoon was his absolute towering idol and the sole reason he joined the company. Jin was the fiercely loving, chaotic older brother who physically drove him to high school and cooked him warm meals when he was deeply homesick. Yoongi was his quiet, intensely protective musical mentor. Hoseok was his brilliantly bright, sunshine-like emotional anchor and dance captain. Jimin was his incredibly affectionate, fiercely loyal soulmate and constant companion. And Taeyoung was his absolute best friend, his partner in beautifully messy, creative crime, meaning that for Jungkook, being completely separated from these 6 men was not just a temporary professional hiatus, but a violent, terrifying amputation of his actual literal family. Even though he bravely utilized the incredibly rare companion enlistment system to stay physically close to his beloved Jimin, providing a desperately needed fragile anchor of comfort in the terrifyingly rigid military hierarchy, the heavy, suffocating, and brutally echoing silence left by the profound absence of the other 5 foundational pillars of his entire existence became a deeply terrifying, inescapable emotional void that no amount of physical exhaustion could possibly fill. Highly confidential, deeply emotional, and fiercely guarded whispers leaking from heavily verified, deeply trusted military insiders and intimately close, intensely loyal staff members vividly reveal a specific, agonizingly quiet, and fiercely freezing winter morning at exactly 4:30 a.m. inside the massive, metallic, violently steaming military kitchen, long before the sun had even considered rising over the treacherous Korean mountains, when Jungkook, desperately trying to focus on his grueling, repetitive task of aggressively chopping a massive mountain of onions for the morning stew, finally completely and utterly lost his fiercely guarded, incredibly strong composure. It is passionately, quietly reported that as the familiar, deeply nostalgic, and savory smell of the boiling Korean broth violently assaulted his heightened senses, his mind aggressively and beautifully flashed back to their cramped, intensely humid, and financially struggling pre-debut dorms, where a younger, desperately exhausted Jin used to lovingly cook this exact same comforting meal for a deeply homesick teenage Jungkook to ensure he didn't starve. And in that intensely vulnerable, shockingly quiet moment, the notoriously invincible, completely fearless golden Maknae violently broke down, his incredibly muscular, heavily tattooed arms violently shaking as he aggressively dropped his kitchen knife, a heavy, profound, and beautifully raw stream of hot, breathless tears violently rushing down his perfectly sculpted, completely bare, and physically exhausted face, desperately, physically mourning the agonizing, terrifying loss of his entire universe. He heartbreakingly, violently realized in that suffocating, intensely steaming darkness that the immense, completely exposed, and terrifyingly massive global stage felt entirely, devastatingly hollow without the chaotic, brilliantly loud, and fiercely loving bickering of his 6 soulmates constantly echoing in his earpieces, leaving him feeling completely, utterly alone despite his massive, historic, world-conquering solo success. But Army, knowing the fiercely burning, completely unyielding, and terrifyingly ambitious titanium spirit of Jungkook, the absolute ultimate weapon of BTS, he absolutely and entirely refused to allow that profound, paralyzing, tear-soaked agony to permanently extinguish his blindingly bright, world-dominating fire. Instead, he aggressively, obsessively, and miraculously channeled that immense, crushing, and heavily isolating sorrow into meticulously, secretly forging the most physically terrifying, vocally devastating, and breathtakingly explosive stage production ever conceived in the history of live stadium entertainment, specifically for the highly classified, mind-bending Arirang World Tour 2026.
Now that we are actually breathing the intensely electric, highly anticipated, and historically monumental air of 2026, massive, aggressively swirling rumors heavily originating from the absolute highest, most secretive echelons of HYBE's creative directing and executive performance teams violently strongly suggest that Jungkook has actively spent his rare, deeply exhausted, physically draining off-duty hours inside the military base, obsessively conceptualizing a groundbreaking, gravity-defying, and wildly aggressive solo and group performance masterpiece, perfectly infused with the tragic, deeply sorrowful, yet fiercely euphoric and violently triumphant thematic essence of the traditional Korean Arirang, brilliantly translating his agonizing, hyper-disciplined military isolation into a jaw-dropping, vocally explosive, and unbelievably cinematic spectacle of violent rebirth and unstoppable reunion. He is heavily rumored to have independently, brilliantly designed the absolute, world-shattering grand finale of the entire 2026 tour, a massive, multi-million-dollar, intensely dangerous sequence where Jungkook violently begins the stage entirely alone, physically suspended high above the colossal stadium by a single, terrifyingly thin wire, powerfully belting an incredibly slow, heartbreakingly raw, and intensely emotional a cappella rendition of the Arirang melody that will absolutely, instantly force millions of fans into uncontrollable weeping, physically representing the freezing, agonizing, and incredibly lonely weight of his grueling military years. Then, in a breathtaking, heart-stopping, and absolutely visually devastating climax that will undoubtedly cause massive global chaos and literally shake the very tectonic plates beneath the stadium, a violently explosive, earth-shattering beat drop orchestrated by Suga will violently rip through the massive speakers, and Jungkook will reportedly dramatically freefall towards the main stage, flawlessly executing a terrifyingly complex, incredibly aggressive mid-air flip, just as a blinding, magnificent, violently vibrant explosion of multicolored pyrotechnics violently erupts around him, perfectly mirroring the exact, emotionally explosive, and completely euphoric moment when his six fiercely returning, deeply missed brothers violently sprint out from all corners of the massive stage, completely and aggressively surrounding him in a beautifully chaotic, fiercely protective, intensely physical, and deeply loving group embrace right in the dead center of the blinding spotlight. He violently envisioned this deeply emotional, historically unprecedented moment to immediately violently transition into an insanely aggressive, full-throttle, fiercely synchronized seven-member dance break that completely obliterates everything they have ever done before, physically interlocking their beautifully scarred, deeply hardened bodies to violently and triumphantly signal the glorious, absolutely unstoppable, and deeply eternal return of the most heavily connected, soul-bound septet in the entire history